Welcome to tonight's chat on AfroSalvadoran. Not particularly the month because Afro-Salvadorans are Afro-descended 24/7, 353. How many days are in the year? 365? And so this is just really speaking about the work that Dr. Danielle Parada and Zaira Miluska are doing around their research, around their identity, around their life, essentially. If you are here by accident, you feel free to stay. If not, you can go. That's no never mind to me. It's neither here or there for me. And we have, I think this will be a really interesting conversation, especially as we confront, and we were just talking before everybody filed in about how there is a certain invisibility that happens or continues to happen when we're talking about people of African descent in El Salvador. And this is something that my colleague, friend, confidant, Evelyn Alvarez always brings up because she's Guatemalan, she's a Black Guatemalan. And she says that, yes, all of these various countries are anti-Black. Myself and Javier, we are both Panamanian, but at least Panama will acknowledge that there are Black people in Panama. There is a grave situation where the country that you are in does not even acknowledge that you exist. And I want to foreground that because as much work as we do, I don't know what that feels like. As anti-Black as Panama is, even as much as they try to other Black people, even as much as they try to say that Blackness is foreign, my experience has never been that someone says that I don't exist. In some ways, yes. I don't want to gloss over that. There is a level of invisibility that I would say that most Afro descendants in the Americas face, but it's nuanced and layered depending on your context and the region that you're from. And so I want to foreground that because quite simply in this picture here, where it says Afro-Salvadoreños, it says existimos, I exist. And the various articles and blogs and people speaking about their identity, the two words that is always at the top is I exist. And so I need that to be centered and considered. Because as we always say, all of these histories, yes, there's the thread of Afro-descendancy, of the memory, of the legacy. And there are different historical processes and contemporary processes that are taking place that need to be understood within their context. And so the art here that's featured is from Carlos Lara, who is someone that you should follow. In the next slides, you'll see some more people. And some accounts that you should follow as well. These photos are from a picture series, or rather one of the many photo series of Tony Gleaton. And these were taken in El Salvador. And this was his work on Afro Central Americans. So this one I actually just happened upon today. And I am showing a couple slides just to ground the context for tonight. Oh, and I didn't, well, we'll get to that. I was like, oh, I didn't even introduce Javier, my the co-founder of AfroLatinx, but we'll get to that. The work is important. And so here is a series of animation. I was gonna say cartoons, but I know that certain artists, they don't like that word, but here are some drawings from the artist Brina Nunez. And I was cracking up a little bit as it relates to the picture in the middle, where they list all of the different Afro-descendant groups in Central America, and then you go to El Salvador and it's like, nope, we ain't Black, we never seen Black people. Never seen a Black person here. We don't know. We don't know what that is. And so they were like, hold on. how is it that you have Afro-descended folks, Mexico, all the way to Panama, because we're talking about Central America, we're in all countries in the Americas, but in this context, how is it that you have these groups of Afro-descended people, every single last country in Central America, but somehow it just missed, right? Do that face again, Javier. Somehow they just missed El Salvador, like miraculously, right? And so in this next picture here, they're like, all right, I know somebody's lying, essentially. Somebody is lying here. And so I encourage people to look up this series of drawings because it's really well done. It has humor also there because in many cases we have to laugh to keep from crying. And here we have a monument, and I invite people to look at the positionality of, I guess, a priest, the Catholic priest that they say freed enslaved Africans in El Salvador, and just how he is positioned and how is the African person positioned. And these are things that you have to read between the lines and notice the conditioning that continues to happen. You erase people, you invisibilize people, and you shrink people, like quite literally. And so that is part of the ongoing coloniality that continues to take place in the region. These are some folks to follow, including Dr. Parada and Zaira, and also here and Carlos Lara and Saint Am Beauty, which is Zaira's project, as well as Saint Am Research. And here you have Afros, where they're doing amazing work documenting themselves and their histories. And this is taken straight from their Instagram page, where they have an Afro album. And it's these really beautiful pictures, black and white, old, new, where they share the stories of their family, their family history, which is essentially the history of El Salvador. And another account in Colochas, which I'm sure Zaira and Dr. Parada will explain if you don't know what that is in a few minutes. And so this little piece at the bottom, this is actually from Dr. Parada's Instagram account, where she shares a ton of history on Twitter and also on Instagram and on her blog and other spaces at Patreon as well. And so this is a depiction of enslavement that took place with indigenous peoples by Europeans. And within this quilt, let me move this because I can't see. There we go. Within this quilt, okay, you have a lot going on. And then right here, we do a little close up. Surprise, what do we have here? We have an African person. And so, like I said a few minutes back, it's reading between the lines, it's looking between the lines, it's actually having, going with the sensations and the feelings that you have. And this is what we talk about in our classes. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. And another thing that my colleague and friend Evelyn says, when there is doubt, there is no doubt. When there is doubt, there is no doubt. If you're like, something ain't right, something's not adding up, the 2 + 2, y'all keep saying it's 5. Y'all keep saying it's 5, and I know it's 4. And so this is what happens a lot when we're talking about Afro-descended history. And this part, you don't have to read all that because that's on our AfroLatinx Travel Instagram page. So you can go and peruse as you see fit. This is a picture that Dr. Parada sent to me. And this is the El Salvador history. And of course, who is foreground, who is centered, literally, again, the positionality. And who are the people on the peripheries? Who are the people on the margins? Quite literally, of the picture here. You have Black folks here. Ooh. And so the quote that continues to come up is that Black people never came, lies. Again, alluding to the first slide, how can every other country have Afro-descended people, but El Salvador is just miraculously does not have that history? It's a lie. And this lie was perpetuated by the former dictator in the 1930s. And so he perpetuated that lie because of that blancamiento, or the whitening period that pretty much all of the Latin American countries bought into, which were whitening campaigns in the 1800s. And I would say it never stopped, because it translates into immigration policies till this day in this region, where these various Latin American governments wanted and invested to bring Europeans to whiten the region, purposely to whiten the region. And so you have this president dictator, however he's framed, that he prohibited Afro-descended immigrants from coming to El Salvador. But he's about 400 years too late by that time, 1931. It already happened, baby. And that was, the process had already begun centuries prior to that. So that, like, again, 2 + 2 is not 5. And so the biggest thing that I tell people to do, and we talk about this in our classes, we have a series of classes coming up in September 7th to 10th, is look at the labor. And this goes till today. Who is laboring and who is leisuring? The racial lines are drawn are very clear in the labor divisions in the Americas. Who can get to sit in air-conditioned office, and who are the ones cleaning? And that holds consistent in every country in the Americas. And so these are just snippets, and this is also on our Instagram, AfroLatinx Travel, where you have Africans into Nicaragua, and you have Africans in Guatemala, and these are not, yes, there were recent, more contemporary migrations, labor migrations in the late 1800s, 1900s, but we're talking about 1500s, 1600s during the colonial period, and really the ongoing coloniality, because I offer that we've never stopped being under colonialism. And so the last part of this slide is the colonial policy had banned indigenous people from working in indigo, yet there was an indigo market. So who was working that market if it wasn't indigenous people? And so I'm gonna stop share, because I'm gonna put this toward the end to show y'all the organizations that you can support and to learn more from. So right now I wanna start the chat with our 2 guests for tonight. And so I didn't say I'm Dash. I'm one half of AfroLatinx Travel. And this is Javier. Javier, say hi to the people.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Good evening, good evening.
And so one thing before we start is, and this comes up a lot, and we had already gotten it underneath our flyer. Are there gonna be actual Black people on this panel? These are brown mestizas, on and so on and so forth. And so we can talk about that, because that's the reality, that these are lived realities. And what I want to remind people of, again, because some people filed in a little bit late, is that to keep in mind that Black, yes, is a racial category. It's also a social category. And this comes from the colonial period through till today. We're talking about if you were classified as Black, or whatever the ancestry was, not just Black, but in this context, Black or African descended. If you were racialized as Black or African descended or African, this decided what jobs you were allowed to have. This decided where you were allowed to live, who you were allowed to marry, so on and so forth. And so, yes, again, Evelyn always has the quotes. Evelyn says, there's a difference between having African ancestry and being Black. And because we encourage people to hold multiple truths and realities at the same time, I don't believe in absolutism, that in certain spaces, there are people who are going to be the Black one. And so if we're talking about, let's say, for practical purposes, between Javier, myself, Zaira, and Dr. Parada, Javier and I would be the Black ones, right? But you take, and again, Danny and Zaida are going to talk about their experiences. Within their spaces, they are the Black ones. And that comes with a set of lived realities and experiences and mistreatment. Let's speak very clearly here. And that can extend to someone's hair, that can extend to someone's physical characteristics, their phenotypes, which we know phenotype is pseudoscientific, but race is based on how you look. And so to hold that, and to understand once again that they are confronting an environment that continuously says that they do not exist. And then also I want to throw out there, I have a running list of African Americans that I'm looking at and I'm like, but y'all saying they Black and Ben Jealous. I mean, I always bring him up as an example. I'm like, he Black? I mean, look. So, you know, again, holding, Javier's cracking up, holding those various realities. You know, sometimes we have to eat that, sometimes we have to swallow that. And I've had discussions with Danny about it. And I feel like every Black person has had experiences where it's like, well, you're not Black enough. Okay, and so what? All right. You know, I don't lay next to you at night. You're not Navient. Like, I don't, okay, I guess, right? So anyway, let me be quiet. I just wanted to put that out there. And welcome Zaida and Danny. And what I wanted to start off, please introduce yourself because I want y'all to say specifically the work that you're doing so that people can follow you. But yeah, to introduce yourselves and specifically the work that you're doing.
I can go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, my name is Danielle Parada. I'm a developmental psychologist working on policy, education policy mostly. So I advocate for marginalized children's rights and their equitable access to education here in the United States and in El Salvador. And I'm also a researcher in psychology, but recently more so on Afro-Salvi history, just because I've realized that there's a lot to uncover that a lot of people don't know, including my own family, including even very prominent Salvadorans. So yeah, thank you for having me.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Zaira. I'm the founder of Central American Art and Beauty. It's basically a space where I try to highlight the positivity in Central American art and just the different diasporas. And it was from there that I started highlighting AfroSalvadorans. And immediately right off the bat, when I started highlighting AfroSalvadorans, I was met with a lot of Salvadorans in the comments in full denial of like, no, you're just making this up. These pictures weren't taken in El Salvador. These are from somewhere else. And so it was from there that like, I've just always been like trying to put out like Afro-Salvadoran content because it's just still so denied within the diaspora. Even like Danny said, even within our own families, there's still like hesitance to want to accept who we are. So yeah, thank you for having us and can't wait to share more.
The biggest thing I've had for, let me share my screen because this is gonna jump right into some of the work that you mentioned to me, Danny, about the Pacific, because we often talk, okay, so y'all can see that, all right. We often talk about the Atlantic, rightfully so, obviously, because of the transatlantic human trafficking system and enslavement system. But the Pacific is Black. And that's something that you can literally, like I have this map up because I plotted the points where you have the various histories of Africans in El Salvador, all of these towns here, and they are on the Pacific. And in one of the slides, in Nicaragua, León and Granada, they were the two places where Africans were trafficked into to labor, and that's also on the Pacific. And I say, let me zoom out. from Mexico, the Costa Chica on the Pacific, you can literally draw the mouse down and going through all of these countries, and the mouse will hit all Black populations all around here on the coast. Right here in Peru, Piura, Chiclayo coast, Trujillo, all the way down to Chile, Arica in Chile, are all Afro-descended communities. And this is on the Pacific. And so spatially, Panama played a very important role because that was the place that connected the two oceans. And so this was something interesting that you shared with me a couple of weeks ago, Danny, about, first of all, Panama was a major human trafficking port where people bought enslaved Africans from Panama, from Portobelo, and they took them to other places. And so this was an important key port for the disbursement of people who were enslaved and trafficked in the region on the Pacific. And something that really struck me when we were talking a couple weeks ago was that you said there's a popular surname in El Salvador and it's Panameño or Panameña.
Yeah, and actually there's a ethnographic study on AfroSalvadorans from Western El Salvador, and that's found to be one of the common Afro-descendiente surnames is Panameño.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, I even have my own family, extended family, who shared that last name, Panameño. So it's right there, you know.
Can you share some of the research that you have come across? Because I know you've written a few blog posts. You spoke about the experience within your own family, of how and Javier and I share often about how we're always stopped in the airports in Latin America. And you said that when you would travel with your dad, you would have to come to the airport like hours early because he was always pulled aside. That also the whole, and I hope it's not still going on, but some of your family saying, oh, wow, they said that you were Black and you're pretty, so I'm surprised. Things like that occur within your own very own families.
Yeah, I remember when now that you bring that up, I'll just talk about that experience because it was one of those experiences that really impacted me and started this journey of like asking, where do I come from, right? And so I think I was like 12 or 13, and it was the first time I went to El Salvador. It was the first time I was meeting a lot of new family. And the thing was that my parents were very protective of us. They wouldn't let us communicate with our extended family a lot of times. They didn't have the best relationship with our family, and we were there for a funeral, right? So it was this weird like space where I was kind of excited because I was meeting people for the first time, but it was for a sad reason. So, I got to meet a lot of family at the same time because they were there for the funeral. And one of the things that I noted was that everyone kept noting how, oh, wow, you look exactly like your dad. You look exactly like your dad. Wow, you didn't turn out like your older sister. You look exactly like your dad, right? So there was always this comparison. And so one day, one of my mom's cousins, my aunt, they asked me to go to her house to go pick up something. And I went, and she was just like, wow, I thought you were going to be ugly because I heard you were morena, but you're actually really pretty. And I didn't know how to take that because I was just like confused. And I was like, I don't know if I should be offended. Like, it's because you're a kid, you don't know how to handle that, right? And you're expecting your family that you're meeting for the first time to be like awesome or whatever. And now that I reflect on that memory and talking to my father, he was like, when I married your mom, it was a really big scandal in your mom's family. And they said, like, por qué te estás casando con un negro? Like, why are you marrying a Black man, right? And not only a Black man, but a Black man from el campo, like a campesino, right? And so he told me they mistreated me a lot, so we wanted to protect you all from all of that, right? And so it started clicking that I didn't really get to know my mom's side of the family that is primarily like Nawa and white, because of the discrimination he had already faced, right? So it's like, it's interesting how they would use the word moreno or morena to describe us, right? While simultaneously saying there aren't any African descended people, but you ask Salvadorans here, how they refer to Black people, African Americans, is, oh, los morenos, right? So it was this very confusing, like, okay, like they're calling me the same label as they call African Americans, but you're saying that we don't have that same ancestry. So like, what the hell, what is going on here, right? And so it's that like what you said, like you're not comfortable about what's going on, so you start questioning it and you start realizing that it's the same connected history of other Afro-descended people.
Yeah, you were like, it's not adding up. It's not 5. It's not 5. What about you, Zaira?
Yeah, almost similar, very similar. That even when my mom is she's more chelita, mestiza. So when yeah, it's very similar that like when my mom got with my dad, my Afro descendants come from my dad's side. My mom's mom, my grandma, was immediately one of the first things she told her is like, ay, te enamoraste con un morenito de San Miguel. And she pointed out this specific department because that's where historically, that's where a lot of Afro descendant people were there. And so I always like, now they laugh about it, but even growing up, it just never sat right with me. And so it was even from when I was a kid that like, I always like was treated differently from my cousins, my white cousins. They would always like try to make fun of my hair, my like the color of my skin. And I was like, okay. But it was also interesting because it was through my Mexican friends growing up that like they would point out like, oh, you're morena. They would give me those terms. And it was one day that like one of my friends came over and she saw a family photo in my living room. And she was like, are you mixed? And I was like, huh? I was just looking at her so confused because I was like, no, my family's Salvadorian. And she's like, oh, she looks Black. Your family member here looks Black. And I'm like, really? And I think it was from there that I started connecting the dots that I was like, okay, wait. I started looking at my dad's side of the family very differently. And like, it started to connect from there. But whenever I would ask questions, I was always met with, no hay negros en El Salvador. Nunca vinieron. They all intermixed, or if they are, it's because son de Honduras. They always associate Blackness with Honduras or from another country. And Dash, you have pointed this before, the Black foreigner, right? So yeah, and it never made sense. Like when you're saying 2 + 2 = 5 to them, and I was like, what? No, it does not.
2 + 2 be equal and -5 to them. Like the point that you brought up, and Javier is laughing because again, we always talk about this, that somehow y'all know where Black people live. They don't exist, but you know where they are and where they live, right? And so I think that's particularly interesting. You wanted to say something, Javier?
Yeah, I also wanted to say my family's also from San Miguel, but there's also a rich Black history in Usulutan, which is like the neighboring department. It has like a very, very rich history of like these Afro indigenous militias that like stood up against the state a lot of times. But the reason I think a lot of people claim they've never seen a Black person in El Salvador is because a lot of times they live in like the cerros, the mountains, right? And these areas that are unreachable because first, those were like the most affordable places to get, right? It was harder to grow any crops there. And so a lot of times, and I'm connecting this to, I was watching High on the Hog and about how like Afro-descended people had to make do with what they were given. And one of the women in the show talked about how one of the plots, they were able to revive it with growing watermelon, right? It just so happened that my dad's community, that is considered some of the worst like area that you could like grow food in, was known for their watermelon crops, right? So and Zaira, you probably know this, like if there's this highway where you can buy these really, really beautiful watermelons, like they're known for it, right? And so I made that connection, how like a lot of these Afro-descended communities will be in these like terrible areas that are thought to be like, I don't know, areas where they won't thrive. And then they've made these thriving communities.
Yeah, exactly. There's just still like communities where there's no clean water. Even having access to water is still like, yeah, it's almost non-existent. Yeah, totally. I agree.
I recommend that series to everybody. I do have some problems with it because I always got a problem because I'm a Virgo, but just in general, I recommend it to everybody because, like you said, there are certain, and this goes throughout the region, there are certain agricultural realities historically and present day that connect Afro-descendant communities. The other part that and again, I see this in both of your work, is how Afro-descended people can disappear in plain sight because of how people are being categorized on census documents, how they're being labeled. Throughout my own research, you get, and this is not only in El Salvador, this is throughout the region, where somebody Afro-descended, 3 years later, 10 years later, now they're Ladino, now they're mestizo, now they're Indio. And it's like, hold on. But the thing is, the state is invested in making sure and putting, presenting to the world that they don't have Black people. They literally made campaigns to whiten the region. So why wouldn't they, on paper, disappear Black people? Because again, I need always to bring up that African descendancy, African blood in the caste system was deemed as unredeemable, that you cannot be saved from this. I don't know how many people have heard of this really ridiculous story of the curse of Ham, that Black people are descended from Ham and we're just a cursed race, according to the white imagination, delusions of whatever, that it's always this striving to become white or to approximate white. Why? Because white is accorded humanity. And this is the biggest thing that I continuously and will continuously mention, is that Afro-descended people have been continuously denied humanity. And so if it has been positioned that being white or being as close to white is what will make you human, that is what people will be striving for. And so this is to ground why, well, one of the many reasons I feel this is the basis of that distancing from Blackness, because why would you want to be categorized as a slave? And this is something, Javier and I, we don't like using that word slave, but this is just, so that you understand what I'm saying. We tend to say African if we're talking about Africans, right? If we're talking about the condition that they're in, we say enslaved. But again, the social categorization of an Afro-descended person or a Black person is slave. And who wants to be that, right? According to the white imagination. For me, that's what happened, right? And the fact that we're still here, that is what I look at. Whatever happened in history happened, and it continues to happen, the anti-Black violence. And so I think for many people, it hurts less to just cut themselves off from that. Whereas actually you're not addressing the real issue here. And so, like you said, Dr. Parada, how you had to force these conversations with your dad, and also remembering that it's traumatic for him. Who wants to talk about their trauma all day and night? Especially, and this is something that comes up a lot when I interview people, people who will say, oh no, it's not a big deal. It is a big deal. But the thing is, the idea is, what can you do about it? So why should I sit here and cry? Right? That's the idea. And that's completely understandable. Because you've graciously, you've shared a lot of stories about your dad. How has it been connecting with him on that level?
It's actually brought us a lot closer together. I can see almost like a weight lifted off of his shoulders in a way. one of the things that I've always noticed is that he's always been mistreated, not only by my mom's family, but he was mistreated within his own family because he has a different father who is Black. That's where he got his Blackness from. So he was very, very abused as a kid by his own family, his mom and sisters, because of who he is, right? And so that's something that he always tried to deny. I mentioned once to you all that he invests a lot in straightening his hair. Like he spends every morning like straightening that hair. That's one thing that I'm still working with him on, but that's his, like, I know that gives him comfort, right? But also I noticed that some of the stories that he told me, like a lot of memories are starting to come up when I talk to him about these things, right? So one thing was like, he told me, you know what, now I'm remembering that this white woman in El Salvador asked me, how does it feel like to have Black skin? And I was just like, someone asked you that? And he's like, yeah. And I told her, oh, you're so dumb. You're just so dumb. And then he just kept it pushing. So it's just like these little instances where I think psychologically, mentally, like he has to just check out, right? Because he wasn't taught a reason why he was different, right? Or he didn't have that history told to him. So before, I think it would just go to the back of his mind, he wouldn't think about it, but having these conversations with him, he's starting to remember these memories, right? He also would tell me that they would call him purple, morado, right? There's also like a Black pig in the beaches of El Salvador. They're very common there. And that's like a slur used against Black Salvadorans too. And so he's heard that. I've heard that actually as well. And so it's interesting how Salvadorans will say, you know, oh, no Black people are here. I've never seen a Black person, but then they'll know how to insult you by using those Black slurs, right? And so that just goes to show that they're just, it's like almost conveniently blind.
Yeah, and another thing, Salvadorans will definitely point out the Blackness in you. They will definitely let you know, oh, your color of your skin, your hair, your facial features. They will definitely be pointing that out to you. So it's also so funny that like, oh, Black people don't exist, but you know how to identify them. Exactly what Danny was saying, you know, and very similar to like how Danny's dad grew up, very similar to my dad's experience too. And even now here in Los Angeles, my dad, when he tells them that he's Salvadorian, automatically they were like, no, you know, eres hondureño, you're Honduran, right? Or Colombian, something other than Salvadorian because of the color of his skin and his hair. And I'm just like, wow, like, but yeah, very similar in that, like, when like, even just the last time my dad went, he was telling me that like, he was in the capital, San Salvador, and like, then he was in I don't know, but he was probably in the mall or something like that, one of the big department stores, and someone was just following him there, just randomly, you know, and just little microaggressions like that even he still feels when he goes and travels over there. So that still exists, and yeah.
There is this Angelique Crawford, our friend and colleague, she says Blackness is not confused. And so, you know, someone following your dad in a store, I know it's a figure of speech, but it's not random. And he's like, okay, this is pretty normalized, right? And in those probing questions, the questions that you ask your family, and how you said that, it's interesting that you said that you had Mexican friends who were like, oh, is your family Black? And then you started to question and look into it. I have an actual Mexican friend, and when I first met him, I asked, "Oh, is your family from the Costa Chica?" because he has an Afro, and he paused and he was like, "Well, my grandmother is from Oaxaca, right?" And he started asking those questions after I was like, "Okay," you know, I'm looking at him like, "All right." And so now he actually goes to a Jamaican lady to do his hair. Like he grew out his hair. um, and so, and so it was this, I interviewed him for my series actually, and he said that growing up, you know, and again, like giving space to remember these memories, to allowing that space so that you can remember yourself, right? He said that because his mom is a white Chilean, that when she used to push him in the stroller, people would be like, "Oh, is his dad black?" Which again, like these are really wildly inappropriate comments for people to be making, number one. And then also I always say Latin Americans are the best, not best, but they're the best eugenicists. I'm like, how did you even pick that up? Like what? But they would ask as she's pushing him in the stroller, is his dad black? And she would say, no, he's Mexican. And I was like, well, she didn't answer the question, did she? And he stopped and he was like, oh, like, I'm waiting. You know, we still waiting. You know, 30 years later from him being a baby till now, like we still waiting for the answer, Ivan. And so he said that he started looking through old photos, and it was the same thing. People were like, oh, that's from your dad's side of the family. And also there's a pattern, and this is a whole nother panel. It's always a dad. That's a whole other panel discussion. But it's always like, oh, that's from your dad's side of the family. That's from your dad's
I will say in El Salvador, you will see a lot Afro-descended people have a black dad rather than a black mom. And that's because there were the laws, you know, in colonial times where African descended men would go and marry indigenous women for their children to be born free. And so that's why if you look at any statistics on, you know, like ethnicity and race, although they're very flawed, the ones from El Salvador, like extremely flawed, you'll see that Black women are the smallest percentage in the whole country, right? Like they'll be like single digits in certain departments. I think Chalatenango had like 7 self-reported, right? And so it's almost like it lets us know the misogynoir that goes on in the country as well. So if you're born as an Afro-descended woman, there's also this, these stereotypes, there's a lot of discrimination against you. There's a lot of these like aggressive traits given to you, right? And especially if you have curlier hair, I think. A lot of times the
hypersexualization,
the hypersexualization of curly hair is huge. So they'll say like hola colocha, and colocho is just a word that we use to say curly hair, right? Very curly hair, usually any type of curly hair, but especially very curly hair. And so people won't call you like hola señora, hola señorita, nothing like that. They'll say like hola colocha, right? Or
hola morena.
Hola morena, hola colochita, ¿verdad? Like things like that, that sexualize you without your consent, obviously, when you're trying to get like pupusas, right? And this creepy guy is calling you colocha in this very sexual way. And what's interesting is I've spoken to another friend who's Salvadoran, who his wife is Afro-Puerto Rican, and she went with him to El Salvador and everyone was calling her colocha when she was walking down the street. So it's interesting how she was called colocha as well, and then we're called colocha too, you know what I mean? So it's like they're identifying, it's like what is the similarity between me and this woman? It's the Afro descendancy at the end of the day, right? And also I will say that there are no protections against people who have colochos, right? So if you have very curly hair, it's expected you either straighten it or put in a bun. People can fire you for that. Wearing natural hairstyles, people can fire you for that. People can run you out of a restaurant if they want to, right? And that does happen. They'll tell you to get out, or they'll claim that you're a marero, a gang member, if you have locks, if you have braids, right? And so a lot of times people will say, oh, you know, I've never seen Salvadorans with braids or locks or anything like that. Those styles exist in El Salvador, but it takes really brave people to do that because it's claiming your Blackness in a very public way, right? That you will encounter police violence, you will encounter discrimination at stores, like being followed, right? And you will you might and probably will get fired, right? And so those are the realities for people with very curly hair, for Afro-descended people. And that's why you won't see a lot of people embrace having braids and stuff like that. They'll wear it at home sometimes, but they won't wear it in public because it means losing a lot.
Yeah, and Carlos Lara speaks on this extensively too. He has on his page as well that when he grew out his afro, he was told to like straighten it or cut it because he was deemed unprofessional, you know? And yeah, it's exactly what Danny was saying, that like you still get discriminated. Like even just like leaving your hair down like this, they'll tell you something like put your hair up, or like why don't you straighten it? You know, those little microaggressions like that still exist. Definitely.
Yeah, the micro is the macro. No, go ahead, Danielle.
Oh, I also wanted to say that you were kind of hitting on this where it's kind of like very eugenicist, like ways of speaking. And you've talked extensively how in Panama, the president was like a Nazi lover, right? So was Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, right? He actually hired someone from the Nazi party to come and build the military school in El Salvador. So if you watch marching videos of soldiers in El Salvador, they march like Nazis. They literally do. And my brother and I would jokingly say, like, why do they march like Nazis? Turns out because their whole curriculum was built by the leading military officer of the Nazi party, right? And so where did they get these ideas of race? They literally got it from these Nazis, right? And so it's interesting how even the presidents are linked in that way, right? It also reminds me of the very militaristic way of controlling people's appearances as well, which was something that happened in the Nazi party as well, right? Women had to dress a certain way, have their hair a certain way, and we see that being transferred in these social dynamics.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because when we're talking about the Blancamiento period, the 1800s, still ongoing today, when Latin America was trying to forge each of their country's national identities, they didn't look to Africa to forge identities. They looked to Europe. And we're talking about descendants of Europe and actual Europeans who are in control. It's not this thing of, oh, that because there's this narrative that, oh, Latinos, it's this certain racelessness that's really bizarre that gets ascribed to Latin Americans as it relates to how the US views the region. And it's just not true. That has never been the case at any point in time in history, even within mestizaje. Mestizaje's whole basis was to whiten the mixedness out of you. It wasn't, its premise wasn't a harmonial living situation. Latin America may have leaned into it a bit more as propaganda, as a way to unite the general population when the white elite needed something done, needed to combat Anglo dominance, needed to forge a way to corruption, money laundering, you fill in the blank. But somehow, curiously, coincidentally, all of the ruling classes, the protected classes, the politicians, the presidents, somehow they're European descendants. Somehow, I don't know how that happened, right? We know how that happened. These are all this is all intentional. This is all part of the national plan and the national campaign. And so we have, if y'all have, from the audience, if you have questions, please put in a chat and we'll ask, or we'll present it. But yeah, the fact that the army was trained by a Nazi, that wasn't accidental. These countries aligned themselves with the Nazis. Like the president that Danny's referring to, Arias, he was a Nazi. He went to visit, Hitler was his homie. He went to visit Hitler. Like, he was like, hey, my dude, like, come on, let's collaborate. Like, and then there was also a KKK in Panama. There still is, really. But there was a KKK party in Panama. It was not unique.
I saw a Confederate flag painted on a bus in El Salvador. My husband took a picture of it because he's an Appalachian. So he's just like, what is this doing here, right? Because that's something that you'll see here in Virginia, right? But you wouldn't expect it in El Salvador. And we saw it there, and it lets us know that those ideologies live there as well, right? And it's because it aligns with the nationalism in those countries, right? And it's true, like we think of, okay, if there are Black people existing in El Salvador, then there's also white people that exist in El Salvador, right? Because a lot of times this myth of mestizaje allows them to claim a brownness that they're not, right? And so I think that that's also a point that needs to be made, that it's not just mixed people. Like El Salvador officially, I guess, is called a mestizo country, and it's like, no, we have diversity, not just with indigenous people, right? Or Afro-descendant people, but we also have fully European descended people that run the country, that have the last name Hill, right?
Right, and
These,
nobody's questioning their identities either.
Exactly. And they have lawsuits to try to win back some of the lands that they lost from the Communist Party, right? Like, and trying to say that they're descendants of that land, even though they're not. They're from England and a saber donde,
Germany.
in Europe, Germany and stuff like that, right? So it's also that it's a false notion, and that I feel like there's a lot more diversity in El Salvador that just the state does not want to admit.
Right, even just the Asian populations that exist within El Salvador too get totally erased,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the fact that there's degrees of mestizos. Not all mestizos are equal, right? If you're a mestizo with more European ancestry, Javier and I are calling you blanquito. Like and we can't continue to pretend that that's not the reality. So I'm gonna present some of the questions that we got in the chat. And so feel free, again, if y'all have questions, to put it in there, and I'll present it to Dr. Parada and Zaira. So we have a question that's asking, in regards to the rejection of Blackness, or rejection of someone's Blackness, is a form of anti-Blackness. Absolutely, it is. Who can perpetuate it? For example, white mestizos denying that someone is Black, but by saying we're all mixed, is plain erasure. But on the other hand, I have Black American friends who have said my Afro-Salvadoran friends aren't really Black. You may have came in late because we addressed something like that earlier, but no, go ahead on your thoughts for that question.
I'll say that it also depends on the African American that you're speaking to. I know in my friend's family that I'm very close, I went to a family function and they thought I was a cousin that they didn't know, right? They're just like, oh, is your mom so-and-so? Is your dad Uncle Jimmy? And I was like, no, my tío is someone else. I'm sorry. And then they're just like, oh, I thought you were one of the many cousins that we might have not met, right? Because he didn't present
probably, right?
Maybe down the line, right? I also want to say that there is diversity within the African American community, right? I've met Afro-Indigenous people here from Virginia that have Native ancestry here, right? And I look just like their family. So I think it depends on the African American that you're speaking to. And I also, at the same time, I hold that in certain spaces, people might not read me as Black, and I understand what comes with that, right? And that's why I always stress that there are Afro-Salvadorans with 2 Black parents in El Salvador right now, because I've met them, right? And they might not have that same issue. So I do want to make that clear, but there is diversity even here in the United States on who we consider Black, right? Because some people argue whether Mariah Carey is Black or not, and they'll fight you to the death about that, and I'm not getting involved in that. I'm not going to give my opinion.
I definitely agree with Danny. Yeah, it definitely depends. And also, just from my personal experience, like with my Black friends, they have pointed out that they're like, oh, you have Black in you. Like, I can see it. Your dad is Black. I can totally see it. So it just definitely depends. And then another thing, one of my friends was pointing out is that like exactly what Dash was saying earlier, that like how is it that like all of Latin America has had Black populations, and how is it that this one little country in Central America like doesn't have that? She's like, I call bullshit. Like I totally see it in you guys and everything. So yeah, I definitely, yeah. It depends, but no, but definitely it's also acknowledging our privilege too. Like you know, there will be times where obviously I won't be read as Black, but definitely within Salvadorian spaces, like the people there, the mestizos, whites, they will let you know, you don't look like us, they will definitely point it out to you. So yeah.
Right. If you didn't know, they'll make sure you know. So I'm laughing because I'm like, that's Dora Lee's daughter. Yes.
Uncle Jimmy little girl. Yeah, you do look like Uncle Jimmy little girl, dang. Yeah,
Yo, but for real though, I looked at his Uncle Jimmy and then I looked at my own Theo and I was like, they do look alike though. Like I was so thrown off, but I was like, I guess you're kind of accurate in that sense, So, and that's not the first time I've had experiences like that too. Virginia has a very like deep history, right? When it comes to the Black history in the United States, like the first enslaved Africans stepped foot here in Virginia. So like here, people like the caste system is very intense sometimes here in Virginia. Like people don't like to call it that, but it is a thing, right? And so I remember growing up being in a room because we have a lot of Salvadoran, Central American kids here in Northern Virginia that I grew up with, and a lot of Black teachers because they were some of the leaders in education equity during the 60s and 50s, right? And so I had a lot of Black teachers in that sense, and they would just be like, we would have to suffer through the paper bag test and things like that. And then they would take out a paper bag and they would just be like, if you were darker than this, you wouldn't be allowed in certain spaces. And so some of us that were darker skinned would just be like, what does that mean for me? Like, I wouldn't be allowed. And they would just, have us think critically about those type of situations and what it meant to be a racialized person if we were actually living in that era and the implications on our life, right? So I'm lucky also in the sense that I had really incredible Black, mostly women as teachers that made me think about those things, right? And made me think about how there's African descended people, not only in the US, but outside of the US, right? So it's interesting how they acknowledged it, but I think because Salvadorans, are so self-conscious about that, I would say, that they wouldn't necessarily go and tell a parent, hey, your child is Black, right? Because they're afraid of the reaction. And that's what some African-American folks have told me. Like, I haven't called certain Salvadorans Black because I don't know if they're going to get mad, right? And I know in some of the memory or some of the things that I've connected with is some of those experiences that Dominicans might have as well with their Black identity sometimes, right? They make that joke on Twitter all the time. That's kind of, it's annoying, right? Because there's a lot of Black Dominicans that acknowledge their Blackness, but at the same time, I understand because we have Salvadorans that are saying, no, I'm not Black, I'm Salvadoran, right? And so it's in a similar, I think, journey that we're going through.
And I think in also acknowledging the level of safety that people may find in denying Blackness, because again, we're talking about a society that literally continues to say that Black people don't exist. So you have millions of people saying you don't exist. It is extremely hard to confront that, to take that on. And specifically for the society that's saying they want nothing to do with Blackness. And I'm talking about society, meaning the state, meaning the establishment. And so in acknowledging that there are spaces where it's actually dangerous to assert your Africanity, your Afro descendancy, you will be penalized for like Danny pointed out and Zaira pointed out, wearing your natural hair. You will lose, or rather not even lose, if you're even hired in the first place. And so we're talking about ways, and Javier says this all the time, ways to have a dignified life. If my avenue into a dignified life is in trying as much as I can to not be Black, to assimilate into whiteness, I'm going to do it because I have to eat. I have kids to feed. I have to live my life. And so this is something that is something that is of particular importance because these are survival mechanisms. If society is telling you, if you do this, you can get a job and you can live a life that's halfway decent, why would you say no to that? Mm-hmm. You're gonna have to conform, you're gonna have to assimilate. And so I think is there another question in here? Hold on.
I have one.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Javier. I'm trying to read the question.
So there's a question that asks, what about dehumanizing questions about Afro descendant hair and Rastas? Like I get in Mexico, how do you all deal with those type of questions? I guess, how do you deal with the questions dealing with your hair and stuff like that? That is,
yeah. I know that locks are definitely associated with being a Rastafarian in El Salvador.
And definitely like a manero, like you were saying, you're a pothead, whatever, very just negative.
Like a low life, they'll say like very just
very negative like stereotype. That.
Yeah. Mostly a marero, a pandillero, like gang member. And I think it's interesting. I've been listening to the new reggaeton podcast. Shout out to them, Loud. And one thing that they mentioned is how it was criminalized, like being a part of the reggaeton scene. And they talk about how it had ties to, the drug selling world, right? But what people don't make the connection is that drug dealers are also talking to other drug dealers in other countries, right? Which means that they're also listening to the same music, right? And so a lot of those stereotypes came to El Salvador. So non-Black people started having those same stereotypes of what amarero is based on like what they've heard from reggaeton, all these like very Black genres, right? So it's interesting that they also assigned those same stereotypes that a lot of Afro-Puerto Ricans were suffering at the same time, and both countries were going through mano dura policies, right? And so I think the biggest source sometimes of anti-Blackness is the police system and how they handle mareros. And so when someone's, says comments about your hair, most of the time, I know people that will just assess the situation first, because again, there are no protections for us in El Salvador, right? So if something were to happen to us, it's not like the police would care, right? So a lot of times people just ignore it for their own safety. I know a lot of people are pushing back now because of these conversations that we're having with Afros, where we're just like, that's just not okay. And we should be able to stand up for ourselves, right? So I see more and more people proclaiming proudly their African ancestry, their hair, and their features. But, there is still a lot of pushback. And some people have been afraid to wear these natural hairstyles and have taken out braids for their own safety, So it at times, you do have the chance and you can tell someone off. But sometimes you have to assess the situation because, they face a lot of Afro-Salvadorans face a lot of violence, especially in El Salvador. Because, if you're not
especially
existing.
If you're a woman, sorry. I was just gonna add, especially if you're a woman.
Exactly.
Femicide there, yeah.
Yeah, actually, we could talk about how, like, the serial killer that just came out of El Salvador was in Chalchuapa, which is a major Afro-descendant town, right? In Santa Ana, right? And how no one cared about what he was doing because he was attacking, a lot of times, Indigenous and Afro-descendant women, right? So those things do matter when it comes to our safety in the country. Yeah.
That's a great point to bring up. Who is protected, who is valued in society, and who is not. And so if the message is only whites or people at least approximating whiteness are protected and valued, once again, why wouldn't I want to assimilate into that? And so you have all of these factors that really grinds down to your safety, to your humanity, and so on and so forth. And so we have, and this is kind of, well, I mean, I'm not gonna read the whole thing because you you wrote a whole dissertation. And I'm like, what that word mean? But no, James asked about Afro-pessimism, and how that fits into nations with Afro-descendants, where Afro-descendancy is actually acknowledged. And so specifically for Afro-pessimism, the thing is, Javier and I have had this discussion, how we're accused of being Afro-pessimists. But I actually don't know enough about Afro-pessimism. What are your thoughts, Danny and Zaida? I will say though that I think there are certain ideologies that, or rather things that happen in Latin America that may not be categorized in the same ways that it's categorized in the US or in other places. So me personally, I don't know enough about Afro-pessimism to comment on that. And from what I know of Panama, I would say that a good chunk of Black Panamanians are simply trying to assimilate. There's that ongoing phenomena that, again, to be safe in the society, you better get your government job, you better get your little light skin or white partner, you better get, all of these different steps, which is, again, not unique to Latin America. We see this in the US, we see this in Europe. This is not, and thank you, Danny, for bringing up the whole Dominican thing. That line is played because Dominicans are not the only anti-Black people. They get scapegoated a lot, and yes, they deserve all that smoke. They deserve it. And we also have to acknowledge that people have been victimized. People have been led astray and led to believe a certain thing. And so if this is the way to your survival, you're gonna adhere to that. You're gonna subscribe to that. So what are your thoughts about Afro-pessimism, Danny and Zaida, as it relates to Latin America?
Honestly, I'll be completely honest. I haven't read as much on Afro-pessimism to have a formal opinion on it. From what I've read, I know that it has to do with the conditions and the humanities of African descended people. I do feel like that is relevant in El Salvador because of the conditions that Afro-Indigenous people particularly live. They live in some of the worst conditions in the country. And so, yeah, that's about as much as I can say about Afro-pessimism, because I'm still learning, like when you're not thinking about these things at a younger age, you're still trying to catch up a lot of times to theories and stuff that a lot of other people might already be exposed to.
Javier, did you want to add? Because you said that you were always being accused of being an Afro-pessimist. And when I went to look it up, I was like, oh, that's my people's.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, basically kind of my summation of Afro-pessimism is everything's messed up. Black people are at the bottom. We can have as much hope as we want to, but the glass is half empty when we want to talk about Black people and it relates to the conditions of Black people and possibilities for the future. And that's why I said a lot of the stuff we do, and like you mentioned, it does flirt with Afro-pessimism, if you were an academic, and to the point that Dr. Parada is making, like, nobody's being taught Afro-pessimism, by the way. Like, it took me until the age of 30 to even hear that word, number one. So it's going to take a while to get to K-12. You got to be a very certain type of individual to like go deep into Afro-pessimism. But I think a lot of things that we do highlight and continue to highlight, and the things that you all said, it speaks to kind of what like the idea of Afro-pessimism from my understanding could be. We talked about, you all spoken about like the material consequences of being Black and expressing a Black identity. even with the hair, the whole hair piece that we just went up, you're going to have more negative interaction with police. You're not going to have a job. So if you don't have a job, you're not going to have access to a dignified life. You're not going to be able to provide for your family. So you're stuck in the same condition, and the cycle keeps running itself over and over and over again. And there's seemingly no way out of this deep hole that you're in. So that's I mean, and again, I'm not advocating for Afro-pessimism right now because I don't know enough about it to say like yes, but I think within what you all are speaking about with your experiences, that there are some material consequences for being Black. Even though that there are campaigns that are going on historically, I would probably say, that are saying that we exist, but there still are material consequences, as you mentioned, Dr. Parada, sorry. As you mentioned, there's no protections. There's no protections. There's none. So for some people, it's a life and death situation. Literally, if I wear my hair in braids, if I wear my hair locked, it can become life or death for me because of everything that's attached to that, a hairstyle. You know what I mean? A hairstyle out of all different things. So
I also want to add, sorry, that like this is still relatively new in El Salvador and within our diasporas as well. So many people are still not taught about Afro-Salvadorian history. So this is like literally the people still doing the work and trying to have these conversations and trying to catch up with everything that we didn't learn, right? Learning, unlearning, relearning. So yeah, that's definitely been the journey as well. And definitely need to catch up on all that too.
Yeah,
well, and you don't have to. Just wanted to say this before I get. It's not catching up, right? Because it's within your own context, and the state deliberately tried to bury this. So
yeah, and they still are.
Yeah,
they still are, because I'll give you a perfect example. We've been trying to organize Afro descendancy celebration for this weekend. We even had a private location where we could have it, but the state wouldn't give the funds. The Casa de Cultura refuses to give funds for it. So does the alcaldía, right? They don't want to give any funds for this celebration, but they can have these soccer games, right?
Yeah, because there's no money.
Yeah, so that's like another way where we see it turn out, where the state is just not supporting these initiatives.
Zaira, you had posted a football player that an AfroSalvadoran football player that you said, I think he missed a shot or something, and people were looking to kill him.
Yeah, he was the goalie of the national soccer team when they went to the World Cup in 1982, and basically it was like, it's an infamous game within our community that El Salvador lost. I think 10 or 12-1. Correct me if I'm wrong. And basically, this was happening in the midst of like when El Salvador was like in the midst of a brutal civil war. So there was just a lot of events happening that the soccer team was just not prepared, and they tried their best. So basically, by the time they returned home, they were looking. The soccer player, the goalkeeper, they were basically he had years later he came out in an interview and said that they were after him. They wanted to kill him because of the way he played and just how I guess it was just a national embarrassment. But that just tells you right there that there's no protections for Afro-Salvadorians. And even the first goal that was ever made in the World Cup for El Salvador was made by an Afro-Salvadorian soccer player as well, but nobody wants to talk about that.
Well, we talk about it, and we just had Javier is the resident sports specialist, Dr. Wallace is the resident sports specialist. We just had a chat about all of the Afro-Latin Americans at the Olympics, and that recording is on our Wi-Fi on our Instagram page. How all of these national teams are somehow, you don't have Afro-descendants, but somehow they appear for the World Cup, for the Olympics, for any type of sporting competition. so on and so forth. And so, and I also, like you said, they had 10 goals. That's a team problem. You scored 10, the entire team needs to go back and practice. That ain't just the goalkeeper. But anyway, here's a couple ways to support the work of the ongoing work, rather. And so we will also send a follow-up email with links, but this is one of Dr. Parada's projects on the ground in El Salvador. And then we also have further reading, and these are all recommendations from Dr. Parada's, the many links that you share on your link tree. So follow Danny and Zaira, and also this book, Blacks and Blackness in Central America. And you also have guiding questions here, discussion questions, which is also on your Instagram. So, don't feel that you have to scramble and write it down. All of this are on the social media pages. And then more folks to follow. And go ahead and take a screenshot if you'd like, just to continue the conversation, to continue the work. And just offering that you're not catching up, right? You're asserting your humanity, you're asserting your history. And that is the project that is ongoing throughout the region, and so don't feel that, oh no, this country is further along or whatever, because in reality, no, we're not. No, we're not. As long as Black people are dying because of an anti-Black establishment, nobody's further ahead. As much as people like to believe that, at the core, like Saidiya Hartman said, we are still living in the afterlife of slavery. And so to that point of Afro-pessimism, the material conditions, the social categorization of Black people and Blackness is still deemed as a problem in all of these different countries. And so that is something to continue to be aware of. I put a link in for our upcoming classes, which will also be in the follow-up email. And then Jackie pointed out their African spirituality in El Salvador. You'll see botanicas. And yes, and naming that, and like you said, in learning and unlearning and relearning, right? To replace that white worshiping conditioning that we've all been internalizing for centuries. And to point out as we wrap up, that idea of not Black enough. We gonna waste time on that? you again, I can't get Navient off my back, and we're gonna have this conversation here about who's Black or Blackest or Blacker. Yes, we definitely have to keep it square that people racialize as Black at all times, that there are material consequences and realities that people, like, for example, I bring up that my Blackness is not mutable. There is nothing that I can do for y'all to not, for me to like take away my Black. There is literally nothing I can do. I will always be Black in every border. And so absolutely, in understanding that dark-skinned Black people, that fat Black people, that disabled Black people, that trans Black people, that quote, on and on and on, that we continuously need to center the most marginalized and the most vulnerable because of the anti-Black establishments that we all live through. That is most definitely what we try to foreground, because within that you have the colorism, you have the featureism, and et cetera, all the isms. And what we're really dealing with is white pathology and white violence. But again, we're not gonna go into that discussion of who's Black enough or who's not, because I feel like every Black person has had experiences like that. And it's like, look, girl, like I gotta pay my rent. Like we're not going down that road right now. So
right. And then just like reminding people that like Blackness in El Salvador is different given our history and the ongoing history. So That's another thing that I feel like, and I'm sure other Afro-descendant, Afro-Salvadorians folks have to do too as well, that like, we kind of have to explain ourselves that like, well, we look a certain way because X, Y, and Z, or we're not recognized because X, Y, and Z, and so on.
And I invite you to not feel like you have to explain yourself, because it's oftentimes it wastes your time and energy and resources, because at the end, they're still going to think whatever they want to think. And once again, Navient is still calling you for their payment. So I encourage people to not expend energy uncompensated at that. Like, you in a whole PhD program and you asking me what? Go talk to your advisor, girl. Like, no. And so I
also
cannot feel they have to be obligated to explain at every turn.
I also want to say that when you question Afro-Salvadoran, there's other Afro-Salvadorans that are watching too, that adds to their fear of recognizing their Blackness, that are a lot less ambiguous than me, that because of the fear of security and all of that, they're like, well, if they're mistreating her, I'm definitely going to just stay in my canton in this mountain. You know what I mean? And that's a conversation that I've had with some of my elders that are a lot less ambiguously Black, that they're just like, you know, you have your struggles, but you don't know what it's like to be me from this canton, where going to the city to go get my cedula has been impossible because they just don't believe I'm a citizen of this country, right? And so I've had those conversations with my elders. They always let me know, you know, that there is some privilege with being more mixed race than them. But there are unambiguously Black people in El Salvador. They just see how you treat the mixed race Black people. And so they're just like, why would I even want to go into the capital if they're just gonna mistreat me worse, right? And so that's also something that I think a lot of people don't think about. Is like, when you're doing these like anti-Black or saying these anti-Black things to Afro-Salvadorans, there's other people watching, taking it in and saying and learning and saying, I just can't participate in society like I'd like to.
Right. And I read and I saw some of the participants here. Yeah, like there are some Afro descendants, Afro-Salvadoran people in this Zoom too that I've also have spoken to, and they have like I don't know, like we all kind of have shared like similarities of growing up and like little microaggressions within the Salvadoran community and our families and society and so on. And it's definitely like just here to reassure that like, yeah, we're here, we've been here, you know, like, you know, we exist, we always had existed, and yeah.
Thank you so much for both of you for your time and for sharing these intimate stories, because, you know, reminder, these are personal stories and personal experiences that you're sharing with perfect strangers. Like, we don't know most of y'all. Like, no, I'm playing. Maybe you got a couple friends over here. Anyway, I thank you for sharing your experiences. And like Dr. Wallace said, there are various ways to articulate Africaneity, and sometimes we have to shift or pivot, or rather expand our thinking and how we think about Afro-descendancy in the Americas and globally, you know, but contextually we're talking about the Americas. Please, I'm gonna send a follow-up email with links to donate to the projects, ongoing projects that the panelists have going on. Also, we are doing mutual aid with a football league in Panama, they're kicking ass and they're just showing out, and they're able to participate because of donations from generous people like yourself. Our upcoming classes, September 7th to 10th, we talk about these topics, continue to, you know, join our discussions. And so I'm glad that Dr. Parada mentioned Gata, the Loud podcast, which is about the history of reggae en español, reggaeton, and all the genres that came from reggae en español en plena. We will be having another Zoom chat Tuesday, August 31st with Gata about the podcast, which is, again, it's called Loud. It's a really good podcast about the history. She's a reggaeton historian, Panamanian, and she's amazing. And so please listen to the podcast. Please join us on Tuesday. Please join our upcoming events. And again, donate to the projects that we tell you about, because again, this goes straight to the people. Nobody got to do an application and give, you know, an arm hair and their cat's eyeball to get $5. No, like it's going straight to the people. We work directly with these communities because we're part of these communities. So thank y'all for joining us. Wait, Javier, you had another question?
It was one that I felt worth acknowledging, at least for a future conversation. So I just put in the chat for everybody to see. I know we're probably out of time.
Ooh, and I have opinions on that. I have a lot of opinions on that.
Well, I mean, we can say one more minute, you know, just to address it, because Danny's like.
I will say that AfroSalvadorans, a lot of times through their self-discovery, self-research, have tried to be a part of Indigenous spaces and have felt the need to straighten their hair in these spaces, have felt the need to change their appearance because they just didn't feel like they fit in the space because of their features, right? And because they just look different. And also, a lot of times there's an idea that you can't be Afro-descendant and also Indigenous, right? When, you know, one of the biggest leaders for Nahuas right now is an Afro-Nahua woman, right? A lot of these Indigenous leaders also have some Afro-descendancy as well. Yeah, Prudencia Ayala was a huge Afro-Indigenous leader. So was Parabundo Martí. Like, it's just, there's a lot of that history. And so, but at the same time, certain Indigenous spaces will try to see Afro-descendancy and indigeneity as two separate things. And so I've met pushback where it's like, we don't want to teach Afro-descendancy classes because this is just an Indigenous space. And it's like, well, some of those Indigenous people are also Afro-descendants and our histories are intertwined. So you're just being fucking racist at this point, right? And so like, that is a thing, right? There is anti-Blackness in those spaces. And so that's why my dad and I, we just keep to ourselves, right? And we just do our own thing with our own community at this point.
Yeah, and I've told Danny this before, and then we both share like a mutual feeling that like we don't really feel like represented or really at home within the larger like Salvadorian diaspora, simply because we're just so ignored, and like there's never that in between feeling, and like, and that's why I'm like so grateful for y'all for having this to be part of this conversation, because I don't even feel like this is even happening within like typical like Salvadorian spaces, you know, like I don't know. It's just, I don't know.
Look, and it's fine to be in that I don't know. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, and in building and forging your own spaces, forging our own communities. And like we mentioned at our other panel, in building and allowing liberatory spaces. Because people often say, oh, these are hard conversations to have. I'm like, hard for who? What are you even talking about? We've been having these conversations. If you weren't, just say that. And so I think it's extremely important to connect with the people who have these shared experiences and shared history. And if it happens to not be a Salvadoran person and it happens to be a Colombian person, a Panamanian person, a US person, okay. I don't, you know, I say this all the time. What has patria, what has nationalism done for Black people? Black people have given everything for the nation, and we continue to give everything. And what we're met with is violence. And so we owe nothing to nobody except ourselves and those who came before us. So thank you all so much for joining us. Continue to join us in our other chats. And we will see you next time. Yeah, we'll see you next time. You have any closing words, Javier?
No, thank you to the panelists. It was amazing. Y'all, I learned a lot tonight, and thank you, Dash, for organizing and being the connector. Wait, is your name still Diaspora Dash? Or no?
On Instagram?
Yeah.
It's
it
Diaspora
Dash?
Dash on
It
Instagram
used to
and
be in a dash. Was it
In a
in a
Dash
dash?
on Twitter. In a Dash
Oh,
on
well, yeah. Well, thank you for being Diaspora Dash and like in being literally that, and making connections across the diaspora in all these different spaces. Sorry, I didn't know which one was correct.
I
But
think I'm gonna change it to Diaspora Dash for for continuity. No, but shout out to Bonnie and the glowing skin. Okay, like all right, Bonnie. Drop the skincare routine. Thank y'all for joining us and for all the people who continue to join us. And we'll see y'all next time.
Bye. Thank you for having
Bye.
me.
Thank you so much.